just realized that I have to do this. All right. Let me go ahead and make an event for this. API. RSPEC. I'm just setting up YouTube right now, so. My God. I think. All right, I think let's go ahead and connect to Hopper while this is setting up. Was it 4926? All right.
Oh, you're all good. I got you started.
Oh, you got me started? All right. Cool. Thank God. All right.
I'm going to do that now.
All right. Awesome. Okay. So I guess I'll just get started. So tonight I'm going to be talking about API testing, essentially the fundamentals of testing Rails API with RSPEC. And so yeah, we're really just going to go over, what is an API a little bit, kind of give you some context on what an API is, how we'll test it, and kind of I'll touch in a little bit about the reasons for testing the things that I'm going to be talking about, and also go through kind of the workflow, right? And we're hoping to do a little bit of a demonstration on testing, setting up tests for a Rails API, right? So again, my name is Jez Go. You can call me Jez, most of you do, but I'm a web developer, been a web developer for 4 years, and I'm currently an instructor at Learn Academy. All right, so really quick, some checkpoints. What is API testing? What the tools we're going to be using are, and we're going to talk about basic coverage, like I mentioned earlier, kind of get a basic idea of what a fundamental starting place for your API tests are, and how we can get started with those. So what is API testing? So in web development, API is usually broadly referring to a JSON API, right? So a JSON API is really just something that a server that is serving JSON data, right? So when we're trying to test an API, what we're really trying to test is the form of the data and how that data is handled throughout the application, right? So that's kind of our starting point. We're really just trying to figure out, okay, what's the data doing? How should it look, essentially? And how is it communicated? How is it persisted in the database? And making sure that those connections are the way they should be. And we test because testing's good, right? Otherwise, bugs be popping up in your code, right? In production, everything looks fine, and then, sneaks up on you, right? So let's talk about the tools, right? So today I'm focusing on RSPEC-RAILS, and this is straight from the docs, right? So it says RSPEC-RAILS extends Rails built-in testing framework to support RSPEC examples for requests, controllers, models, views, helpers, mailers, and routing, right? So it basically extends your RSPEC tool so that you can do things like controller tests and request tests, and that's why we're going to focus on that, right? So that's the tool we're going to be using. And briefly, I'm going to cover what we're going to test. So for a good start of your Rails testing, you're really going to focus on your models and your requests. All right, so testing your models does this for you. It allows you to test the integrity of the data that comes in, right? So here's where you can specify how the data should look and kind of put those standards in place, right? Request specs are ensuring complete responses to the API request. So we're talking about when the client hits this endpoint or this URL, is my Rails application able to receive it? Does it recognize it? Does it go to the right controller method? Does it bring back the data that I expect? So you can think of models as closer to your unit tests, and requests is like your integration tests, right? So your models, you're just testing your one class. A request test is testing everything, right? It's testing all the way from the routes, all the way back to your active record models and seeing how those things are connected and if they're working properly, All right. So we'll start off with the setup, right? So setting up RSPEC-RAILS in your project isn't too difficult. What you really need is RSPEC-RAILS in your dev environment. You're going to add your gem RSPEC-RAILS to the gem file, and you're going to run a generate RSPEC. Oh, that's a little wrong. Autocomplete is kind of messing with me here. This needs to be RSPEC, but we'll see that in a second. And we'll see this right now because I'm actually going to go over model testing right now. Model testing is here are the points that are associated with this. So models are basically the core of your application, right? They represent what your data should look like and how it should work. So basically we're going to be testing how to ensure the data is in the form required by the app. So we're going to focus on validation testing as an example, right? So I'm going to go in and pull up some code. Let's see, so right now, let me actually show you around the application. I actually created this application earlier for the students here at Learn. So it's basically a Pokemon tracker app. Right now, I'm connected to it through Postman, right? So I can do a GET request, and I see, looks like my server's down. Let me go and fix that. Yeah, it looks like I just closed it. So Rails S. So I'm going to show you around. So this is, let's see. Rails S, am I not in my, yeah, CD, Pokemon tracker. It's my Rails S here. And what we have here is basically a CRUD application, right? So we have basically all the things that you would expect here. So I can do a get to Pokemons, and I'll get all the Pokemon that exist in my database. I could do, let's see, a post here. Let me go ahead and demonstrate really quick a post. Let's see, Charmander Fire, sure, send that. And I get Charmander back, and if I do a get to Pokemons again, I'll see that I have the new Charmander here, right? So this works all well and good for now. So I'm talking about model tests. So I have a view of that set up here. Let's see, 300, 3002. Oh man, shut that down too. Okay, let's add that. Let's see, we have CD. Let me set up my front end really quick. Yarn start. And kind of demonstrate what I mean by when Pennywise basically sneaks up on us. But here we go, getting rid of this yarns to start up. I'm going to set my script here. So we talked about us testing the validations, or like the form of our data, right? Right now I don't have any validations on this data. And it works, right? So it looks like it works. The only problem is, if I were to do something like this, send that. Oops, let me go ahead and change this to my post request. So I'll send an empty post essentially. Oops. Oh, well, let's go ahead and do this. Let me go ahead and bring this back. You might have a situation like this. Where I'm posting an empty bit here. If I refresh this page. So as far as I can tell, the API works. But at this point, right, this is a bug to me. This is already an instance of Pennywise is already in the building, right? Because you probably don't want records in your database that are empty. So let's go ahead and apply a validation test to this. So let's set up our tests. I'm going to go and add some things here. So I mentioned setting up your RSpec in your application. Let's see, let's tracker app. So I'm going to CD into my backend application. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to locate my gem file. And what I'm going to do is set it up inside of this group here, right? So your gem file is pretty big, but inside of development tests is where you want to set up your RSPEC-RAILS. So it's going to set that package in there as a dependency. I'll bundle install here. And once that's done, like I said before, what I'll do is Rails generate RSpec install. And that is going to do something for me here. So here's my Rails application. It's basically going to set up some files for me. All right. So what it did is create basically my testing setup, right? So it sets up my folder where my specs are going to live and create some spec helper files to make it connect to the Rails application. All right. So let's generate our model test. So what's cool is RSpec actually has some commands that you can use. So I could do Rails generate RSpec model and give it Pokemon, right? So inside of here, now I have a model file in my specs, and I have a basic test file for my Pokemon, right? If I do RSpec, we'll see that I have that pending test here. It'll give us this sort of output, right? It's basically saying there's nothing implemented yet. So this is kind of a BDD approach to my validations, right? So I'm going to say that, hey, this shouldn't be empty, right? Species type shouldn't be empty. Let's do an example of that. It must have a species, right? So I'll say do, end here, and I'll say Pokemon is equal to Pokemon create, and I'll say species, say Bulbasaur, I guess, Pokemon type is grass, as I was educated by earlier. So let's do an expect statement. So really our test looks like this, right? So a case will look something like this. It'll have an it block with a string telling you what it's testing for and the actual stuff that the test is actually running. So here I'm saying create a thing and then expect. This is the actual thing that's checking. Pokemon or expect Pokemon dot. Oh, actually, let's do this. Let's change that up a bit. Say this. We're going to empty create. We'll basically have an error situation here. Pokemon dot errors, and I can test a value in the errors. So species to include, I guess, let's see, must include, what's the test for this? Must exist. This is probably the wrong one, but we'll check it out. So I'll do RSpec here. And this string is probably wrong. Oh, wait, what? Must have a species. Am I in the right branch? It says. Let's see. Pokemon create species. Oh, this makes sense. It's actually doing the right thing. So it's passing, and that's my confusion is my fault. I don't have here because I don't have the validations on there yet. So this is what we'll do. We'll create a validation. So validates. We'll say species presence true. Thing is, we want this to fail, right? Because I don't have species added. All right, so here's our failure, right? Let's see. Creating So must exist. So here's the actual string I want, right? So a validation, our presence validation is actually generating the can't be blank here, right? So let's update that because that is the validation we get, the validation error we get for that test, right? Can't be blank. So now we have a passing test. All right, so let's go ahead and implement that for, right? So we're just going to say must have type. Right, do. So Pokemon is going to be create. Great. And this time we're going to expect errors on the Pokemon type. Can't be blank. All right. So it looks like I need an end here. So this should fail as expected, right? Because I don't have a validation on my Pokemon for the Pokemon type, so I'll set that up. Since true. All right. All right. So that's an example of setting up model tests. We're just basically saying, hey, the data should be the way I need it to be, and setting up our validations for that. All right. And there are there are different ways to do this. I've seen some people have the philosophy of like, hey, set up a new thing, test that it fails, right? Test that you get the errors and then update it and see if the real thing comes back on a successful thing. So that's another method of doing that, where you're basically creating the failing and the passing, right? Cool. All right, so let's get back to the presentation. All right. So that was our model spec demo. So request testing. So again, this is testing the functionality, right? The ability to basically connect to your application and get the things that you expect. So basically just testing to see if your app can receive that request and that your app provides the necessary response, right? So in my case, so for this example anyway, the controller actions already exist. We're just going to be testing them, right? So I have all of these things set up, but we can write up some tests to make sure that they function in the way that we want them to. So I can run, again, I can use one of the generate commands, RSPEC, and say requests, and I'll say Pokemons, right? That's going to generate another set of tests for me. So requests in its own folder, right? It's going to set up my requests, all right? So let me find, I should actually go like this. So I could do a text search here for my file. So I want this to be my tests, spec, models, controllers, style sheets. There we go. Close this guy out. There we go. Here's our request folder in our Pokemon spec. It generates this dummy test for you, but you can set up your own. So I'm going to go ahead and simplify this a little bit. Right now it's testing basically the index path. We'll update this so that it makes a little bit more sense. So I'm going to say that it's testing the Pokemon's API, and I'll say it can list all Pokemon, right? So I'm going to at first create a thing, right? So I want my test database to have some Pokemon in it, so I'm going to create species Pikachu, which is an electric type. metric. And what I'll do is say, hey, let's make a request to /Pokemons. And this is kind of where the extensibility, you can kind of see it working a little bit, right? Because we're seeing that RSPEC is giving us a way to make a GET request, kind of like a client, right? Let's see, so I could say get Pokemons, and I could say that I'm expecting some JSON response back. And let me go ahead and say that JSON.parse. So we want to get the response.body essentially and parse it. And so we're going to have these two things. So we're going to have an expect response to have 200, right? Which is a good base test, right, for this. RSPEC. I'm going to run that. Can list all the Pokemon, but we can go a little bit further and expect JSON response. Let's see, we can say JSON response, maybe the first one, dot species to equal, I'll try equal, and it's Pikachu. Might be wrong here, so it's saying undefined method, so I think I have to go ahead and change how I'm calling that. All right. Oops. There we go, right? So we can reach in a little bit further and make sure the response has one of the things at least that we created. All right. So that's an example of, a request type of spec, right? So, actually, I want to check on time. How am I doing on time? Really good? Okay, cool. So let's do another example. So let's just do another example of like a little bit more of a complex request, right? Because we probably want to test to make sure that, hey, if it gets some params, we can do some things with it and it gets the right response back. So we could say, hey, it can create a new Pokemon. All right? So it's another do statement here, end it. And this test is going to look a bit different, right? So we're going to have Pokemon params. And inside of here, I'm going to go ahead and add my strong param key here. And inside of here, we'll say species. Let's see. It's one I haven't used today. Magikarp. That's the one I haven't used today. And that is a Pokemon type of water, right? So this is what this would look like, right? Because this is a little bit more complex. It's not just a GET request. I have to actually pass things in with it. So I could say post Pokemons, and I could say params are my Pokemon params. Params here. All right. Then we'll do similar things, right? We'll set up our JSON response object here, or a variable here. That's just the JSON.parse of the response body. And we'll have an expect here. So let me expect to make sure that I get, one, the correct status. So here I'll have a status 201. Expect, and let's see, response dot to have HTTP status of 201. And I'll also go ahead and inspect. So expect JSON response species here, just to mix things up, just have that complexity there. 2 equal so let's go ahead and run RSPEC to run those tests. And we see we have a passing test, right? The cool thing, of course, being like if something were to change in the API, I'd know when it was a breaking change, right? Because I can easily run the tests and see, oh, that was a breaking change, right? That broke how my API worked, those kinds of things. All right. Cool. All right. I'm so used to doing this. Are there any questions actually right now? I just couldn't help it. All right. Cool. So that is basically request tests, right? So that's kind of what they look like. They basically try to attempt to touch an endpoint on your API. And so those are like, so requests and model tests are kind of like the basis, right? You're basically figuring out or setting standards for the data and making sure that your API can be communicated with.
Can you expect like the form of the structure? So say I want to get back a hash-like object as a key, and then the value of another hash, and one of those has a key, and then the value of an array. Can you like create something like an expect statement that looks for the form of what the response is?
I believe there are matchers for that. I have to look, but RSpec has a ton of matchers that allow you to check all kinds of things. So I imagine there must be like some way to check if this thing is a hash or if it's an array. And if not, there are ways to kind of imply that in your tests. But yeah, that'd actually be really cool to see how complex you can get with those expects.
Right, so yeah, not as much the content that's getting back. Like I don't need to know that they got 1, 2, 3. I just need to know that it's an array that had stuff in it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know of a way for that specifically, but you can ask that it is an array by saying, hey, is it something with a length, right? You can use array type things on it. Yeah.
Like say, maybe I just map perfectly to JSON. Just be JSON like a hash and this is a hash. You know, if it's itself, it's a real object that has some properties or something. Since you're not really interacting with your model directly through, you could do completely since you're taking your Ruby object and it's what's in that, it's just so the more information I get to sort of a different API than to different types of data.
Yeah, so I guess I'm kind of pushing out a little bit. So instead of like simple models like this, I'm thinking about like for services that maybe are drawn from a bunch of different models and then combined in various ways. So I still need to know that the front end is going to get a data, like a specific data structure.
Sure.
Yeah. Just boring.
Yeah, that's a really cool, yeah, it's an interesting idea. I mean, there are ways, like I wonder if you could probably, one of the things I think about immediately is looking at the class of the thing that got back, right? To kind of get an idea, but yeah, it's an interesting, yeah, kind of problem to kind of solve, so yeah. Are there any other questions? Cool. All right. So, let's see, I think that's about it. So I did that. So that's about all I had for you. So I really just wanted to get those as kind of your basic. So happy testing. If you don't, this is something that might happen, right? It's just gonna pop up in production wherever it is. All right. So resources are really just the RSPEC-RAILS docs. They're pretty good. Navigating them is a little weird sometimes, but that's where the bulk of the information I got came from. So yeah, if there are any questions, you can come bug me. These are my things on LinkedIn and GitHub. But yeah, if there are any, I can answer any last questions. If there are any. Yeah. Yes. I don't know, like, some of the things are actually pretty nice about it. like really small things though. For example, the MD preview, that was built in. Like I didn't have to install anything, which I found I had to do in Atom. Also the terminal, like that terminal that I can actually pop up, that was also built in. Like you didn't have to, you know, reach out to, you know, the packages and try to find it. It was just there. So those are like the little things that I kind of like about it. There's also like a really extensive theme set, which isn't important to a lot of people, and it really shouldn't dictate what you do, but this is an example of that. So this is, I downloaded, and it has a bunch of these. So like if this is your thing, if this makes you happy, try VS Code, right? But yeah, it was kind of a pain trying to find something that was actually readable up here though. So you have to be careful with that if you're doing presentations. I've only ever used Atom otherwise, and Vim. I dabbled with a little bit of Vim, so, and that was a lot of fun too. But, I'm sorry? RubyMine a long time ago, yeah. I liked it, but like it felt at the whatever time it was too complex. There was too much going there, but yeah. I like kind of medium.
Sales rep?
All right. All right. If there are no further questions, thanks for coming out and listening.